Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. Well, you've probably heard of the Associated Press, the AP, it's also known as. Well, it was started by a Connecticut man, Moses Yale Beach. And that's not all that Moses Beach did. He was the mover and shaker behind the New York Sun. That was the first newspaper for the common man in the country. And he was also a secret envoy for the government during the Mexican-American War. Well, here to explain the background of this very interesting individual is Bob Beaumont. Bob's the president of the Wallingford Historical Society, and Wallingford was Moses Beach's hometown. Bob's going to be along in just a moment to share the incredible background on Moses Beach. This week's trivia question: he was one of the country's most important military commanders and was said to have killed the last wolf in Connecticut. Who was he? Well, stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you're going to know the topic for next week's show. The man we're going to talk about today, Moses Yale Beach, contributed a lot to society, and that's because he was innovative and had innovative businesses, and he was generous. Now, as his middle name suggests, Moses Yale Beach was descended from the family that started Yale College, and yet his education, as you're going to hear, was extremely limited. Just like so many people of his time more than 200 years ago, he took chances and he used his ingenuity to try and create things. And he created an institution that's still with us today, notably the Associated Press. Now, that's a news gathering and distribution service, and it's used by every news organization in the country. In fact, they'd be afraid not to use it because they would miss hundreds of important stories that are carried by the AP each and every day. Well, here to tell us about this remarkable man is Bob Beaumont. Bob's president of the Wallingford Historical Society. That's the town in which Moses Yale Beach was born. So, Bob, I'm excited to talk about Moses Yale Beach. Explain to me when he was born, the kind of family he was born into. What were his circumstances in life when he was born in 1800?
Moses Yale Beach was born on January 15th of 1800 to Moses Sperry Beach, was his father, and Lucretia Yale Beach. The Yale in his middle name comes from his mother's maiden name. She died within 3 months of when her son Moses Yale was born. Hence, he was raised on a farm in Wallingford by his father and his stepmother. As a young farm boy, did all sorts of chores, but by the time he was 10 years old, he was doing all sorts of chores on the farm. Bit of a creative individual at a young age, because what he would be doing is he'd be making toys for himself. He'd also make toys for some of his fellow students. He went to a farm district school in what is now known as Yalesville, about a mile from his house, and he decided he had enough of school. He wanted to become apprenticed to a cabinet maker in Hartford. So at the age of 14, his formal education was finished. And that is where he really developed, if you will, what would be his work ethic and the determination that he would have to become successful, both in business and in life in general.
I think looking at his career, you might say that he was certainly ambitious, but not always having success, right? Because he got out of that cabinet apprenticeship and ended up starting a cabinet making business that didn't quite go anywhere, and then he tried some gunpowder experiments and things. So, he tried a couple of things. He always had ambition, but, until he got to the New York Sun, or actually until he started his paper business in Ulster County, things didn't really take off for him, though, did they?
Once he bought out his apprenticeship, and I want to mention that because he bargained with his master to get extra work. He was paid 2 cents an hour for his extra work, so that by the time he was 18 years old, he'd accumulated several $100s, $400 of which he used to go ahead and buy out his apprenticeship. That's the equivalent of about $10,000 in today's money. So he put in a lot of hours to get $400. In addition to that, he also had another $100 to $200 left to go ahead and start his own business. Now, you're absolutely right. Initially, when he started his business in Massachusetts, It was a fairly successful cabinet business. He was also honored for his excellence in cabinetry work. It was at that point then that he started getting into some other things. Now, you mentioned that he got involved in gunpowder. Well, he came up with an invention, a gunpowder powered balloon. Well, that didn't work out in large part because of the weight to be required. Looked at the idea of getting into steamboat transportation between Springfield and Hartford. If it hadn't been for some financial woes, that could have been successful. However, what he did get into and what he did come up with that proved to be extremely successful, maybe not for him, but in the long run, was a rag cutting machine that he developed that was used in the paper industry for the next 100 years. He did not get any financial success out of this because of the fact that he delayed in getting a patent. And by the time he was getting around to getting a patent, somebody else had already patented. So he didn't get any real benefit from that. However, he ended up leaving Massachusetts at that point, heading to Saugerties in Ulster County, New York. And this is where he invested heavily into a paper mill. He was there for about 7 years, the first 6 of which he was quite successful, became somewhat of a well-respected man in Saugerties. By 1829, he was one of the trustees in the town. His 7th year there was not particularly successful. It was a financial disaster due to various investments that he had. And that is when he went down to New York City to join his brother-in-law, Benjamin Day, in the comparatively newly founded New York Sun. Became the production manager there. Getting into the newspaper business is where he became good at what he became very well known at and became very wealthy from.
Can you explain to us, the New York Sun was something called a penny paper? Can you just explain what that was?
Absolutely. Benjamin Day had founded the paper in 1833. Prior to Day's coming up with the penny newspaper, they were done by subscription. The price on them would be 5 to 6 cents a piece, which was something in the range of $1.75 to $2.10 today. So they were not inexpensive. Day started something that, with the penny paper, he was getting news out there that most people didn't know, because the traditional newspaper would be more about public figures, about the senator, the state representative, the mayor, various other things that were happening in government and by, if you will, famous people. What Day did was to go ahead and report on the common man. The first police reporting was done by the New York Sun. So there'd be reporting on police activity. There'd be reporting on personal things such as divorces, marriages, etc. This was never done before. In addition to that, you were seeing innovations in terms of marketing. Prior to the penny paper, it was the subscription rates that carried the paper. Now, by and large, the traditional newspapers didn't really make money from selling newspapers. They made money by printing other types of publications, be it books, magazines, etc. But the penny paper made money not necessarily from the sales, at a penny each, but it was by the combination of the mass production and by using advertising. And it was the advertising, probably as much as anything else, that helped to carry the newspapers early on. What they also did was they ended up having, if you will, newsboys. In other words, they had young men go out there and they were selling the newspaper. They were, if you will, hawking the newspaper in the streets of New York. And because it was only a penny, which granted was a bit of money at the time, it was equivalent of today's maybe 25 cents, but it was affordable for a lot of people. They got to see news that they would not normally see. The middle class and the lower classes had a chance to participate and become aware of what was happening in the world, which they didn't have prior to the penny press. Beach, when he first got in there, almost immediately bought out Mr. Wisner for $5,200 on credit, paid that off within the year, and within a couple of years ended up buying out his brother-in-law for somewhere between $20,000 and $40,000. One of the things also that the penny press did is they ended up publishing things that writers had done. Case in point, Edgar Allan Poe a number of his stories were published for the first time in the New York Sun. Going back a little bit earlier than that, probably the first sensationalism that you would see in the newspaper came from the Sun. Case in point is the, quote, Great Moon Hoax of 1835, was told about a bat-winged race that inhabited the moon. Or maybe the balloon hoax, talking about a hot air balloon trip across the Atlantic. That latter one was retracted 2 days after it was printed. However, there never was a retraction of the Great Moon Hoax. This was done to go ahead and attract readership.
Now, one of the things that he also attracted was sort of the attention of a lot of very prominent people because he was having such success with the New York Sun. And one of them, of course, President Polk. And the other thing you can say, I think, pretty safely about Moses Yale Beach is that he was extremely patriotic. And therefore, in 1845, Texas becomes a part of the United States. Mexico didn't take kindly to this. And suddenly now there's a war between Mexico and the United States, which I think probably a lot of people forget that we were at war with Mexico in 1846. And President Polk turned to Moses Yale Beach and asked him to do what?
To begin with, Beach was planning to go down to Mexico City, in large part for business reasons. But he met with President Polk and Secretary of State James Buchanan, who, of course, would become our 15th president, a decade later. There was a letter from Buchanan to Beach appointing him as a, quote, confidential agent to the Republic of Mexico, one might say a spy. Any communications back to D.C. would come through the American consul in Mexico City, one Mr. Black, who would then send it to the U.S. forces in Veracruz. Now, Beach was to be paid $6 a day. And if you will, to use a modern term, basically portal to portal. In other words, from the time that he left until the time he returned, he'd get $6 a day, which is not an insignificant sum at the time, plus expenses. He went not with his wife, but his daughter, as well as with Jane McManus Storm, who was a correspondent for The Sun, spoke Spanish fluently, and was very familiar with Texas because she and her family had been involved in investments in Texas for a good number of years. She'd worked in Texas. So this was the threesome that got British passports and sailed into Veracruz. Initially, they were arrested because the military didn't believe their story. They were incarcerated for a short period of time, but were able to talk their way out of that one, I guess, and they got to Mexico City. What Beach was to do, as far as Polk and Buchanan were concerned, was to go ahead and try to find a means of maybe negotiating a peace, if not really negotiating a peace, at least starting that process. Part of which would have been to go ahead and encourage the Catholic bishops and clergy to raise an army against Santa Anna, who was the president and the general who was fighting primarily with Zachary Taylor up in Texas. And why would he have been doing it with the Catholic Church? Very simply, Santa Anna had confiscated a lot of the Catholic Church's land, and they had also confiscated a lot of the money that the churches had to go ahead and finance the war against the United States. So the prelates, bishops, etc., were not at all happy with the president of Mexico. They were able to go ahead and raise an army of about 5,000 people, so that there was success in that manner. Santa Anna came back with the idea of cleaning house in Mexico City, and that would have meant in part to go ahead and capture Beach and any other American sympathizers, etc. Beach managed to get out on that. They escaped, came back home. He had quite a conversation with President Polk. And from Polk's diary, Mr. Moses Y. Beach had called and had a long conversation with me on Mexican affairs, where he had gone several months ago, in the character of a secret agent from the State Department. He gave me valuable information. That's the end of the quote in Polk's diary. I would have to say that probably Beach's mission was likely of some help toward ending the war, since the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed later in 1847, granting territories to the U.S. of California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and parts of Texas.
So now we know that he was in Mexico City for a little bit there. And we know that his New York Sun correspondent was there with him, and we know that the New York Sun was covering the war. What now becomes very interesting in the story of Moses Yale Beach is that when he gets back to New York City, suddenly he's able to beat his competitors to getting news from the front on that war by 24 hours. And they're all shaking their heads wondering, how is he doing this? And this is where another great invention of his would come to life. Tell us that story.
Basically, how he got news from the war zone via fast packet ship out of Veracruz coming into Mobile, Alabama. There would be post riders that he would go ahead and hire to go ahead and take the news further north. When I say further north, this would have been up as far as Richmond in Virginia, because Richmond, Virginia was the terminus, the southern terminus of the telegraph at the time. Richmond would go ahead and then transmit to New York. So he was getting his news always ahead. And this wasn't just with respect to the war, because he did this in getting news from Washington, D.C. earlier, because he would hire a train to go from Baltimore to come up to New York. And even on that short distance, he would beat his competition by 24 hours. Because of the expenses involved in, the ships, hiring post riders, etc., he ended up getting together with several of the other newspaper men in New York City. And basically what they ended up doing, they ended up sharing expenses. And this was with 4 other newspapers in there. And this was basically the founding of the, if you will, the New York Associated Press, which was a predecessor to what we know of as the Associated Press here in this country. This man was not a newspaper man to begin with. He was a marketeer before people would have called him a marketeer. So much of what he did was stuff that would be done by marketing people today. Unbelievably creative individual.
Beach's New York Sun also put out the very first syndicated publication. That was back in 1841, a 2-page supplement that was sold to 20 newspapers throughout the Northeast. He also started something called the American Sun, which was the first newspaper to be sold and distributed in Europe. And Moses Beach loved education so much that he donated money after he retired to build up school libraries. He gave out books to students who excelled academically, and in fact, some of Bob Beaumont's ancestors received some of those books for their standout educational achievements. And Moses Yale Beach donated 3 acres of land to continue the town's evolution from one-room schoolhouses in farm districts, and those are the ones that taught every grade within 4 walls, to what were called graded schools, which featured separate rooms for each grade. And the contribution of the 3 acres for that building was granted to his hometown by Moses Yale Beach on his deathbed. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. One last note about Moses Yale Beach. He was so patriotic that he raised and donated $100,000 to the U.S. government during the Civil War in his attempt to finance the effort to keep the Union together. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Bob Beaumont. He's the longtime president of the Wallingford Historical Society. Well, the answer to this week's trivia question, the question was again, he was one of this country's most important military commanders ever and was said to have killed the last wolf in Connecticut. Who was he? Well, the answer is Israel Putnam, the Continental Army general whose nickname was Wolf Putnam, after his unbelievably daring confrontation with a wolf in Northeast Connecticut. We'll tell you that one. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to have an expert who's just written a book about the famous Israel Putnam, with some of the exploits that made him renowned for his bravery and his capabilities. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.